Now let's talk about some of the automation points you can have in your MLOps pipeline. So again, we've been through the whole process. So MLOps best practices are basically here to help you determine how mature your process is. So the level of automation that you have in your MLOps pipeline is going to tell you, well, how mature your whole process is. Because to add automation to a pipeline, you really have to have very intimate knowledge into the business logic behind the model, into the data behind the model, into the production configs, into the features that you use, into literally every part. So the more that you discover as you work through this process, the more you'll be able to feel comfortable with automating. So the number of parts that you can automate will really tell you how far along you are. If you're in the very beginning of setting up your MLOps pipeline, there likely won't be a lot of automation to build in. One big mistake that teams tend to make is they get caught up on starting automation as early as they can before they truly understand the core of the process that they're trying to automate. Not every part of your MLOps pipeline has to have automation in it. Some parts are perfectly fine if you leave them manual, but the number of parts that you can automate, you probably want to spend the time to at least research how much effort it will take and how long it will take to test once you have decided to implement the automation. Then you can start to get into some of the fancier things. So you can decide if your team is ready for experiment orchestration, which is another cool way of saying you run all of your team's experiments in the cloud. So how do you build Docker containers to run every experiment on? Do you deploy to EC2 instances? How do you decide when those instances are spun up and spun down? This is where some of that more in-depth infrastructure knowledge comes in handy, because this is where you might start to use tools like Terraform in order to move different Docker containers around different instances, and you're interacting with multiple services and scripts to get those instances in the correct state. So as you start to get more comfortable with how your experiments are being run, and you know how your cloud resources are managed and how much they cost, it's worth looking into this experiment orchestration. And it doesn't hurt to try out continuous training of the model in production. Not necessarily always, you know, updating the model in production, because you do need some manual testing in there just to validate things. But you can constantly train your model to respond to updates in data or concept drift or really any of those changes that happen in production. Continuous training just means that after you've received so much data from production, or after a certain amount of time has gone by, you trigger your MLOps pipeline to run from the very beginning. So that's why we try to have as much automation as we can, because you can do this continuous training, which will definitely help you when you are trying to get your models updated and to prod as quickly as possible. You might think about creating a feature store to standardize all of your features. So after you've gone through your feature engineering step, you and the team might have decided that you've settled upon a certain set of features for this iteration of the model release. But you want to change those features the next time you do your whole MLOps pipeline. So what you can have is a feature store, kind of similar to a model registry, where you just keep track of all of the different features you use for your model training when you get to that step. This really helps you to move back and forth and experiment quickly and deploy quickly and get through your pipeline with as many configurable parts as you can. Something else that needs to be decided on is what actually triggers the automations in your pipeline. So for example, when you have, let's say, your pipeline has monitoring in it, and you've reached some threshold that you've set, and now your model is stale on production. So do you want to trigger your redeploy pipeline when a certain threshold is met? When it comes to data ingestion, do you want to limit the amount of data that you pull in from your data sources? And once you've reached that limit, you trigger your featureization step. Do you want to take your experiment evaluations and move the models that fit a certain accuracy threshold to your model registry? These are some of the things that you can start thinking about for triggers to the automation. Even in the CI/CD pipeline, you saw how different parts get executed based on the branch that you push to or based on the environment that you're trying to deploy to. So there's a lot of different places in your MLOps pipeline that can use triggers based on metrics from your model, based on limits from your data, or based on the environment that your model is running in. And you can always build your CI/CD pipelines to have multiple jobs. So you might have a job in your pipeline to handle source code changes. And once the source code's been changed, it's bundled as an artifact and it's stored inside of the model registry or something like that. Or you can have your CI/CD pipeline execute unit testing every time you get ready to deploy to staging, just to make sure that your API executes and returns a value that you expect. So you can use your CI/CD pipeline to handle a lot of those moving configuration parts. And then probably the biggest thing to keep in mind is that every MLOps pipeline will be different. Now, you'll probably have kind of the same high level process that you go through, but when it gets down to the details, it just depends on what the team uses, what tools you have access to, and the kind of data that you're working with. For example, some teams really love AWS and other teams really like GCP. That is going to change so much of how you interact with your cloud platform because they're two completely different platforms. There's just some things you won't be able to transfer between them. Even with features, you'll have different data sets. So yes, you might want to set up a feature store for your different projects, but what goes into the feature store, it's going to vary quite a bit. So always keep that in mind when you're working with any MLOps project, because these automation points and their triggers will happen at different times and for different reasons.